How cruel could the dressing room be in cricket?
How cruel? It could be very cruel. I think it could be, depending on the characters that are in there. I think such a good question, that, because it can be, because of the nature of cricket. Cricket's an individual sport played by a team. So you've got 11 individual mindsets who are in various different sort of spectrums of mentality of where they are, their games at. So there could be somebody in the corner who's under so much pressure, somebody in the other corner who is top of the world. And what he's saying and what vibes he's giving off in the dressing room, completely different to player B, who is in the corner. I think if you want to go from an experience point of view, I'd say the biggest and the most high profile, I think, example you can make is somewhere like what happened with Kevin Pietersen, because that was cruel for me. I don't know the ins and outs. I don't know the full ins and outs, but reading people's books, listening to comments, talking to people that are around, there was one guy in that corner who was, I wouldn't say he was getting bullied, but he was the brunt of a lot of people's jokes. And we've all been there. We've all, there's many times I've sat in the dressing room and powerful characters, Flintoff, Harmison, Hoggard, these characters are powerful with sort of, vocally, bouncing around. They need that sort of interaction, or some people just like to sit in the corner. And, Ian Bell, quiet lad sitting out the way. Straussy sitting out the way, very, very quiet. Others, in pockets of 3s and 4s, that can be dangerous sometimes. And somebody is always on the end of it. There's always somebody getting nailed. That's what the dressing room's all about. But I think probably the most high-profile case of where it's been, probably has been cruel, is probably Kevin's. Kevin got some stick during that time where it was, there was a so-called corner of Broad, Anderson, Swan, Pryor, probably one or two more that were not having Kevin at all, and they were going against him. You have quiet characters like Sir Alistair Cook, who's trying to manage it all. And I'm just going, I'm speculating a little bit because I don't know exactly what happened in there, but I'd imagine Kevin was not in a dark place, because he's a big lad, he could fend for himself. But I think at times there was definitely the relationship between one person and another person falling out, which I think probably was from festering a long time from the Notts days of Pietersen and Swan. Then if one character becomes very sort of powerful with allies around him, that other one individual can feel very sort of isolated. He could feel, I think, victimized of what's going on, and that doesn't always, marry for a good dressing room, a strong dressing room. And one thing I'll say about, going back, if we go back through experience, I look at that 2005 dressing room, and there was 12, out of the ones that played, they were all solid characters. Even Collingwood that came in to make it 12. They were all, characters of men rather than, I don't think they were gonna isolate anybody. Freddie would have a 45-minute spell of going around just battering everybody. That's, fun areas, good elements, everything helps when you're winning. But I thought during the reason why that team was so good was because that dressing room was so strong, and the people that were in it could fend for themselves. I don't think there was any animosity, any jealous, he's getting this or he's getting that. I think if you've got that, you've got a good dressing room. The minute you become successful, and all of a sudden he starts to get this endorsement, he starts to get that, he's not concentrating on his game because, he
gets a T20 franchise.
That's it. The IPL was a big one. The IPL was a big one. There was a little bit, not fractions went that way, but if you're going on examples,
it's just jealousy, isn't it?
A little bit, but if you're going off examples, we went back to India in 2008 after the terrorist attack, and there was a lot of talk about who was going back and who wasn't. And obviously Kev was captain, and Kevin's was very, very powerful, very vocal, got to go back this, we've got to go back that. And I'm not saying it was all driven on IPL contract, but the IPL was there now. The IPL was very real, and England players wanted in. ECB weren't letting them in, but England players were trying to get in. And Kevin was the biggest one. And I remember I remember making a comment during that time when we were talking about going back. It's like, we're going back. Some people are going back for different reasons here. You're going back because you need to go back because of IPL. Some of us will never get to the IPL. Some of us my days had gone, my days were finished. I was nearly out of the team. And you go and we're not making judgments on. So cruelty in dressing room, I think there's the different characters it depends on the characters you've got in the dressing room.
You can't help. Cricket is a unique sport insofar that with most sports, you're in the dressing room and then the game happens and then you go. But in cricket, you're in the dressing room, you play the game and then you go to the hotel where essentially you're still in the dressing room, right?
Yeah.
So the cliques,
as
the tour goes on, get stronger and stronger.
And if things aren't going well, then 2006-07 Ashes series was just,
at the end of, say, I don't know, you pick a day from that tour, you get back to the hotel and does everyone just go in their little groups?
Yeah, families were there as well, so that makes it not even worse because you want your family around, but then you are on your own and you get a chance to go where. I mean, I play in many, many golf events, and I love Swanee to bits. I've been around Swanee since I was 17 years old, and everybody comments on how good Graham Swan is. What a great character! What a funny lad! What a brilliant! Yeah, I was like, you have him for 15 minutes. Can you imagine in the dressing room for 6.5 hours? And I love Swanee to bits. I mean, I think he's one of the most infectious human beings going. But for 6.5 hours, and I've had this conversation many times with a lot of the footballers who go on these trips talk about Swanee, and I'm like, you go in a dressing room, what's the longest you're in a dressing room? 40 minutes before a game. You get to the ground at 1:30 for a 3 o'clock kickoff. You're out the dressing room by 2:10 on the field and doing your warm-ups and everything. You got to train in the morning, get to training ground at 9:30. You're on the field at 10. As soon as you're finished, you're gone, you're out. So the most you're in a dressing room is 45 minutes max. I'm saying we might win the toss. We might win the toss and bat first. So he's got pepped up energy. We might bat all day, and we've got 6 hours with some of these characters. And that to have tolerance levels during that time is, I mean, you have to be very sort of restrained and not wanting to chin somebody. If you've got characters like that, and he's not the only one. There was millions of them, but Swanee was the biggest one because. I mean, he was a great character. I mean, should he have played a hell of a lot more cricket while Duncan Fletcher was there? Of course he should have. And I think it was more the character that Duncan didn't like rather than the cricketer. I don't know that for a fact, I'm just speculating, but for him not to play any cricket, real cricket under Duncan Fletcher, I think that's something I came to the conclusion that Duncan wasn't keen on the character that's there. But in a dressing room for 6.5 hours with some people is challenging. It is challenging. I'm sure there's a lot of people who I play cricket with will be saying exactly the same about me.
Well, what about? I'll ask you a minute about because the dressing rooms you used to be in would be very different. I mean, whether you're playing for Durham or England, you formulate relationship. You've played for a long time, right? So you formulate relationships and you have your buddies, and you kind of know where you are. But the dressing rooms for St Lucia or whatever, I mean, that must be quite strange to even get a kind of like relationship between players that essentially will know each other from other franchises, I imagine, but they'll be varying different ages, different nationalities, and they know as soon as this tournament's over, whether you win or you lose, you're out of there, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting watching them that first week try and work each other out.
Right.
Because everyone's trying to work out where they fit in, right? Am I the loud one here? Am I the quiet one here? Am I the joke person here?
Yeah.
And that's before you get to the cricket stuff of, which overs do I bowl? What role do I have out on the field and everything else? And it's a very, very fascinating way of going. I remember my first time on the team bus, I sat down and Roddy Eswick, the former Bayesian legend bowler, who's West Indians coached quite a lot, just came up and said, "Jarrod, that's my seat." And I'm thinking, isn't this the first day? How does anyone know what seat we even have on the bus? But that was Roddy's seat, right? That's where he sat on buses. And, you know, you listen to Roddy because he's a legend. And so all that sort of stuff is really, really fascinating. And you're right, they're trying to work each other out. What I found was that I think there's a real lack of leadership training when it comes to cricketers. All the way up. So tactics isn't a problem, right? And you guys know what to do in terms of cricket and everything else. But I do think they don't really understand, you know, and you can see this in under 19s cricket all the way through. It's a bunch of lads together and bouncing off each other, and everyone thinks everyone can take a joke, but not everyone actually can take that joke. Not everyone sees that as a joke. We've seen it with the racism stuff. We've seen it, you know, with stuff about, you know, homosexuality and all sorts of things in the change room that players don't like, right? Don't like to be abused and don't like to be called those sorts of things. And I would look at the WhatsApp groups of the teams I've been in and just be like, there's no office in the world that would allow this, right? And you just have to get to a point where everyone has to understand this is a professional environment. And I think the problem with locker rooms sometimes is they just go way too far to, you know, lads on tour on a golf trip, right? And it just needs to come back to that professionalism. And that's not on the players, because these are players who've come up through the system. You would have had David Boone pulling you aside when you said something silly and giving you a clip on the ear. And that's what you then did to the next generation. That needs to be education from cricket boards, right? Of like, no, this has changed now. This isn't the 1970s. We're not trying to break, you know, beer drinking records, and we're not trying to, you know, count how many women we're sleeping with and all that sort of stuff. Because we see how these things end up, you know, in courts. And you know, we've seen some English cricketers get themselves in trouble on group chats where you're just like, why would you ever be on a group chat like that? You have to educate these people on what being a professional cricketer is. And I think within the change room, that's the one thing that, you know, and I'll probably never be in charge of another cricket team again, but I would love to, you know, take it to that level of showing them how to be leaders within the group so that everyone feels like they're on the same team. You want to go to that, you want to get that 2005 mindset where everyone feels, and I remember Ian O'Brien telling me once, a New Zealand team that told me once that the best change room he was ever in was a New Zealand team that couldn't win any games. They just kept losing and kept losing, but they all just started supporting each other. And he said that when we were winning, everyone was worried about their next deal and, you know, who they would get signed with and who got picked up by a counter. But when they were all losing, they were all like, we've just got to support each other. It's finding those sorts of things. And I remember the Islamabad United general managers, they were all like bloggers and podcasters who came in, who took over. Now they work for the Pakistan team, right? But when they came in, they did these little tiny things, like they made sure that the senior left-arm bowler would have lunch with the junior left-arm bowler, right? And they were two different social cliques completely. It was just like, we just want you to talk, we don't care if you talk about left-arm bowling or not. He needs to learn how to be a professional, and we want you to help him become a professional, which put a sense of responsibility on the older player. Little things like that are very, very important. Of course, we've seen teams take it too far with, you know, the Australian team going on the Kokoda Trail and going to Gallipoli and all. You could make it a bit silly at a certain point, and I know cricketers sometimes roll their eyes at that sort of stuff. But you know, if you're in the top 3 or 4 players, if you're a captain, a vice captain, you know, or a senior member of the side, you're in management. And you know, John, as someone who's been in management yourself, that's a very different position to be than just being someone who's part of a team. And I don't think, in my experience of having worked with cricket teams, people think about it that way. And that's where a lot of the errors come from. Oh, it's just all bants. Well, it's all bants until the guy writes a book about it, slagging you all off, right? Yeah. Then it's not bants, right? And you know, the Kevin Peterson one's really interesting because essentially what happened was, through no fault of English cricket, there were just 2 very different groups of people. All right, there was this one group, as you talked about before, that you know, the Big 4 group. But then you had people like Trott and Peterson and Carberry, very different kinds of human beings. Yeah. And they are strong people who didn't like the way that they were treated by the popular kids, right? Again, that's management, right? And you know, you read Mike Brealey's book, that's all, his book is basically just a self-help book for managers, right? And I, you know, having been around teams, I just don't think that those sorts of things are trained in cricketers, that is what you need to learn, how to do that sort of stuff. You know, you look at someone like Michael Clarke, he can tell you when a leg slip needs to go in, right? He can tell you when he needs to do a bowling change. Michael Clarke didn't really understand how to manage other people. It just wasn't part of his personality. And I wonder now, looking back, I saw that as a default of Michael Clarke at the time. And now I look back and I go, That's from Cricket Australia. They hired a manager and they didn't actually teach him how to be empathetic with other people and how to deal with other people.
On AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.